Welcome to my second Javelin tutorial from the Suicide Squad. In this tutorial we'll be focusing on the detail on top of the Javelin. So when I did my research for the detail on the Javelin, I noticed there was a recurring pattern. I didn't have exact references to it, but I did have enough images to kind of make my own version. To make my own pattern, I designed it all on Inkscape. If you have access to my Javelin files, refer to the file that's called Transfer Template. I made two different sizes of file for this, so use the one that's closest to the diameter of your base. The diameter of my base was 30 centimeters, so I used the one that said 30 centimeters. You'll notice this template looks slightly different from the one you see on screen. That's because I ended up changing the design to simplify it. I designed the pattern in a way so that it is a mirror image, so I only need half of the pattern as a template, which fits nicely on an A4 sheet of paper. So once I had designed my pattern, I then printed it out. Printing it out let me see if it would fit first. Once printed, I trim off the excess, using a steel rule and a Stanley blade. So now we have two templates printed out that I can put back to back. So I wrapped it around the Javelin and just made sure it went all the way around. If you've used the 28 centimeters template guide and you find it's too small, try the 30 centimeter one. If there's still some differences, what you can do is put the file into Inkscape or something similar. Make sure that the dimension lock is off so that the height stays the same, but then you can change the width. It will skew some of the detail just slightly, but everything should still match up in the end if it's just a slight difference. The first area I'm adding detail to is the main part of the Javelin. I wrap it around the Javelin and add masking tape to hold it in place. So as you can see, for the second printout I have, I just match it up to the first one. That way I get the full pattern. I do the exact same thing to the other side. The main thing to watch when adding this pattern is that dowel A matches up with dowel B when they're fully screwed together. Otherwise, one of the pattern's not going to be aligned with the other. To be able to match up the templates on either side of the Javelin, I will need reference points. So I mark out at the point where the template divides, with a gold metallic pen. I then use a steel rule to best I can draw a straight line right down the middle. This part is tricky, and there are possibly better ways to do this, but this is what I did at the time. I then was able to judge the line and see if it was straight. I continue using the masking tape to temporarily hold the template down. With both patterns on the Javelin, you can see this is how it looks at the moment. So one of the issues when adding this pattern was actually how was I going to transfer it to the foam? So what I did was grab a pen, then I punched holes through the design. Then that meant when I took the design off, I could then join up those dots with pen. From doing this, I learned that the pen was maybe a bit too big. It does leave some holes. With some of the finer detail, I used the end of a drill bit. I think something in between would be your best bet. Something else I also picked up was to really just put the dots where the main detail is. If there's fine detail, I wouldn't bother putting the dots on that just yet. It's quite easy to line up with the foam once you've got it all cut out. Your main thing is just to have references of where things go. I continue adding punches throughout the whole of the design, on dowel A and dowel B. This is the drill bit that I used to punch in the fine detail. I actually found it a lot harder to see these holes, but I still managed somewhat. Please be sure you've punched all the holes when you do this, as you don't want to realise that you've not got enough reference points. Once I'm happy I've added enough holes, I then take off the guide. Once the holes are punched in, this is what it looked like. To join all the dots, I use a metallic pen. It shows up a lot better on black foam. I used a gold metallic pen. If I went back, I would actually use a blue metallic pen, which was another colour I had. The reason for doing that is when I added glue later, it kinda made it really hard to see the gold because the glue is yellow. So I highly recommend using a colour other than yellow. I continue drawing in all the lines and joining the dots. Some of the holes I made were quite visible. Most of this will be covered in foam, however if any were visible at the end, what I did was fill it in. You can fill in holes like that using decorator's caulk, or what I did was just add extra sealant and keep adding until the holes were filled. You could also use foam clay. When I finished one half, this is what it looked like. I could then go on and do the other side. I also added in these straight lines. That was to remind me that this is a textured part. Once the detail is on, I will be dremeling this to create a texture. When both sides were done, this is what it looked like. So this is actually my original idea, which was to burn in the lines. I just really hated it and ended up scrapping this and completely redoing it. If you are going to burn in the lines, then make sure you use like an open cell foam. This is quite closed cell and it just wasn't really that suitable. I thought it might work, but it didn't. I really wanted a cleaner look than this, so I came up with an idea. I took the pattern that I made on Inkscape and I transferred it to Cricut. If you haven't heard of Cricut, it's a machine where you can feed in material such as paper, card, foam, anything like that, and it cuts out the pattern for you. So you design it on a computer and then it cuts out for you. It does lots of other things, but for our use, we want it to cut. If you're taking my pattern and cutting it out on a similar machine, I set the material to foam and I use the default setting. The thickness of foam I'm cutting is 1mm. They do recommend 2mm for this, but I did manage to cut the 1mm. I didn't want it to be too deep. So you can see here I've cut out the main skull pattern and I'm going to glue that onto the Javelin. For the exact quantities of what you will need to cut, you can refer to the document called Javelin Design Instructions. To glue my pattern on, I'm using Impact Contact Cement. It is my preferred glue for foam as it creates a very strong bond. So what I do with each part that I've cut with the Cricut, I just add glue to one side and then I add glue to the actual foam Javelin and then I stick them together once they're dry. Always make sure the glue is dry and not tacky when you're gluing. You might notice that some of my files look a bit different when I was doing this. That's because it was still a work in progress, like I have refined the files quite a bit. One of the trickiest parts I found was this bit in between the skull patterns. This part has texture on it on the actual Javelin. So remember the part I drew straight lines over to mark out that it was to be textured? This is the part that I found hardest to glue. I found the easiest way to deal with this was to use baking paper. The contact cement does not stick to the baking paper, and it means you can easily slide it out gradually to avoid anything gluing in the wrong place. You can see I glue the top and then I gradually move it down to help work where I need this part to be. Once I did one side, I could then do the other side. Next, I go back to the Cricut and cut out detail group file 1 and 2. You can see on the screen here I've actually put them all onto the same file. However, to make this more accessible to cut on a smaller mat, I divided this into 2. So there's 2 group files and not 1. Also note that I'm using a purple mat. This is the strong grip mat, which I would recommend for foam, as it gives it enough hold to not slide about when it's cutting. Take your time when adding this detail, it does get a bit tricky. The main thing is though, you've got your template as a guide underneath. Some of the details taken from the detail group files are quite thin or small. These can be more challenging to glue. However, an option for you is you can actually use super glue. I didn't do that, but the super glue is actually fine for small details because they do not need to flex much. Therefore, for any foam project, you can do this for small details as a resolution. So this was what I was meaning about adding texture to the middle part. I completed this one and now I'll show you how I do it on the other side. In order to get this sharp texture, I use a very small cylindrical head with a flat top for the Dremel and Dremeled in all the lines. I made sure to Dremel lines in every single direction. I just kept adding and adding until I was happy with the look. Keep in mind that this foam is only 1mm thick. I wouldn't go too deep with the Dremel, as this could potentially cause some rips in the foam. You can see I add the detail all the way up to this part. I also quickly want to note that obviously it looks a bit of a mess now, there's quite a lot of glue, but I will be showing you how we can clean that up later. But obviously always try and be as neat as you can, because it'll make your life a lot easier. To make the leather look strap for the handle, I decided to just cut a wide rectangle of 2mm EVA foam that was long enough to be the handle, and I got some tin foil and smushed it up, but not too tight. I got my iron and I pressed it on top of the foam with my iron, which is a great technique if you're wanting to add texture to leather. Please note that I used the highest setting on the iron while doing this. You can see once I'd finished, it was looking quite effective. To glue on the handle strap, I want to make sure it's cut at an angle at one side, so that when I wrap it around, it sits flush. When I wrap the foam, I basically want it to just catch the edge of the other piece of foam underneath. I don't want it to overlap too much. When I am happy with the rough angle of the wrap and how it's going to sit, I then add glue to the Javelin and glue to the foam leather strap. Once both sides were dry, I then started to glue them together. You can see I'm very attentively checking the overlap when I'm doing this. When the strap's overlapping the part underneath, it's only overlapping about 3mm or something like that. It's really just catching the edge. The way the strap overlaps is very uniform, so I'm very consistent with this all the way up while I am gluing. When I did this, I didn't have a definite length of what I would need, so I had to cut the top freehand when I had finished. The next challenge was to make the gold plates that sit over the handle of the Javelin. My Javelin screws into two parts, and when I unscrew it each time, I don't want to be disrupting foam, which is more flexible, so I decided I want to make the plates hard, and the easiest thing to do with foam to make it hard is to cover it with Worbla. In order to cut these plates, I used the file called Cut Oval Plate. It's easy enough to cut out of foam, but you can also put it through the Cricut. Please note, if the edges are raggedy like this, just get a little bit of sandpaper and they come right off. So using the foam part, I put it on top of the Worbla and I draw around it. I always leave like a centimetre extra around it when I'm doing that. Then we can move on to sandwich the foam in between the Worbla. If you haven't used Worbla before, it basically glues to itself. And to mould it, you need to add heat, so we use a heat gun. I use a wooden sculpting tool and just go right around the edges. For any excess on the edges of the Worbla, I can cut them off with scissors. Just make sure you don't cut too much off or you'll have some of the foam showing through. I wanted the Worbla to be in the right shape, but I didn't want to mould around the Javelin in case it got stuck or anything like that. So what I did was I took a curtain rail that I had and used that to mould the shape. Once I've moulded the Worbla over the curtain rail, you can see that there's been some air bubbles formed. If you ever find that with Worbla, what you can do is make sure it's a bit hot enough first, and then take a little pin and pin through the Worbla. Then you can kind of squeeze the air out. And what that'll do is it'll just leave a tiny little imperfection rather than a big bubble. It's much easier to fill the imperfection than it is to hide the bubble. I repeat the process for all 4 plates. Before I glue on the plates, I mark out where I want them to be. If you refer to the foam pattern that you've already glued on the main part of the Javelin, the plates match up in a certain way, so keep that in mind when you're drawing out where you want your plates to be. To mark this out, I just drew around the plates that I had. So obviously I've already added the foam for this handle, and it does not sit flat, there are ridges. So to make sure the plates bond with the largest amount of surface area, I Dremel down anything that you can't see once the plates are on. This ensures that when I add the glue, we get the strongest bond, and it avoids them coming off easily. Obviously, be careful where you're Dremeling, you don't want to ruin your leather strap. Once I was happy with what I had Dremeled, I then add glue to the plate and the Javelin, let them dry, and then I glued them together. Once the first plate was on, the second one was a bit trickier. The second plate goes around the first plate when it overlaps. To ensure it fit around the other plate, I then added heat, moulded it again over the curtain rail, and I put it back over it when it was a bit lukewarm, and that meant it gently sort of moulded into place, without disrupting the curve too much. Now, because the second plate was moulded a bit bigger than the first plate, in order to fit round it, there's a slight gap underneath. So the best thing I found to do was to add some foam clay. This would mean that the foam's raised up underneath and gives enough sort of surface area for the glue to set and give the strongest bond. To make the surface as smooth as possible, I roll it with a wooden dowel, so that it was nice and smooth. The drawback with foam clay is it takes a while to dry, so just keep that in mind when you're doing this. Once the foam clay was dry, I then added glue to the Javelin and glue to the plate and then glued them together. So with the detail added to the main part of the Javelin and the handle almost completed, I then want to skin the ends of the Javelin with foam. You can see there's a gold and a silver part to the Javelin. I'm basically covering the silver part. When we mention skinning foam, we're basically talking about taking a very thin piece of foam, in this case it's 1mm, and gluing it over the work you've done to make it look cleaner. The tapered ends of the Javelin I've made are obviously covered in foam clay, they've been sanded, etc. So this will make it look a lot more streamlined and clean. I found a scrap of 1mm foam I had. I added glue to the end of the Javelin and to the foam. It's a good idea to use some baking paper when doing this. The contact cement does not stick to the baking paper, so it means you can line it up easily. What I did first was kind of mould the paper around it, and then I removed the baking paper and smoothed it all out. The main thing here is just to make sure there's no sort of gaps in between the Javelin and the foam that you're skinning it with. Once the foam was added, as always, I added some pressure to the seam with my fingers, cut off the excess with scissors, and then Dremeled down the seam. Obviously the ends of the Javelin are now slightly thicker. I felt this would be fine because there is a ridge that separates the two and they're both separate colours. So as before, I transfer my pattern to the top of the Javelin. Just note that it does taper down, so you might find it slightly difficult transferring the pattern. I just tried to match it up as best I could. I then removed the pattern and joined all the dots as before with a metallic pen. I then cut out all the pieces I needed on the Cricut. I went ahead and glued these on. Once the detail had been added to the silver part, I was left with this ridge here. There's not actually meant to be a ridge, it's meant to be smooth. To blend it out, I use a Dremel and I try and get it as close as I can to looking flawless and smooth. I also hand sand it with fine sandpaper to try and get it looking as streamlined as possible. Next, I wanted to add some extra detail. There's a slight ridge at the bottom of the silver part of the Javelin, so I just cut out a very thin piece of foam and glue it around the base of that part. Next, I took the soldering iron just to add holes into some of the details. I obviously didn't like the look of this before, but I did use it very minimally at this point, so you didn't even really notice. There were a few details that looked raised on the Javelin to me, so I added this with foam clay. I basically created little oval shapes and put it on the part that looks like a hook. I then used the soldering iron to mark in some lines on the foam clay. I still had to create the emblems that go on top of the gold plates. However, the point in which the gold plates meet is not flat. There is a ridge there where one overlaps over the other. So I take some scrap Warbler, heat it, and add it to the middle of the plates there and smooth it out with a wooden sculpting tool. This gave a much flatter surface to work with. I also created a base for this on Cricut. This was extremely helpful to make sure all the parts were the same size and it gave me something to work with. We want these emblems to be in exactly the same place, so draw some sort of reference line on that's straight so that you can line them up. I then glue that base on top, glue the second piece of foam on top of that also, and then I can build out the detail with the foam clay. Before adding the foam clay, I want to clean this foam underneath from any contact cement that will be visible. To clean up the foam, I use adhesive cleaner. Always check the safety instructions and ensure that you wear gloves when doing this. I got some Q-tips, dipped it into the cleaner and just wiped off the glue. This meant I could clean hard to reach areas, but normally you would just use a cloth. Just to show you the difference, this side has not been cleaned and this side has been cleaned. I've previously moulded the clay on one side, so let's do the other side. Keep in mind that craft foam does take a while to dry, so you'll probably have to do one side and then do the other side once it's dry. When I was moulding the emblem, I didn't have an exact version of what I wanted, but then I knew that the foam clay takes a while to dry and that I could work with the design that I had, and then all I would need to do is copy that design on the other plates. I designed this emblem from looking at reference photos. It looked like there was some sort of figure on there holding an item, so I just used that and kind of worked around it. Sometimes if you add a little bit of water to the foam clay, it does stick a bit better. There's a fine balance when doing that because if you add too much water it gets too sticky, you'll end up with it all over your hands. Please note I did use a soldering iron here to add holes, however it was cold, it wasn't even on. So I just kept adding foam clay and playing about with the shapes until I was happy. Now, I previously had added texture to the gold part of the Javelin, using a head for my Dremel that was cylindrical with a flat top. This created deep, thin lines. For the silver part on the reference photos, it looked a lot less severe than that. So I actually changed it up and used a small rounded head for the Dremel, and this meant that the indents were a lot less severe. This gave a really nice contrast to the other texture. I found it increasingly difficult to blend the pattern into the taper at the end, so I had no other option than to add some foam clay just to bring up the level. After some careful hand sanding, it looked a lot better. So here is the Javelin with absolutely everything added. There's only one thing I want to do before sealing and painting, and that is cleaning it up. So as before, I take the adhesive cleaner and spend quite a long time cleaning this up. In order to get into the little nooks and crannies, I use a Q-tip. But not just any old Q-tip, I use cosmetic buds. They're large and flat on one side and small and pointy on the other side. These are perfect as I can use both sides to effectively remove as much glue as possible. Make sure you wear gloves, dip the buds into the adhesive cleaner, and then you can rub off the glue. Depending on how much glue you've got on there, it can take quite a while. You can see mine's is quite a mess. If I could go back in time, I would have been a bit more careful, knowing how much effort this will take. If you try and glue as neatly as possible, you won't have this same bother. You can see that the part of the Javelin on the left is much cleaner than on the right. That's because I've already cleaned that one. So that's how effective this cleaner actually is. It does actually remove most of the glue. You don't want to leave the glue on here when you paint because it will be visible. And it really affects the overall look of your prop. So here we are, our final base structure and detail for the Javelin is complete. And now we can move on to the next step, which is sealing and painting.